Most of the grammar that we talk about in English 11 is going to focus around the various comma rules. Commas do a lot of work in the English language. They perform many different jobs, so mastering the comma rules is a pretty ambitious goal, but if you do get really comfortable with using the comma rules, not only will your own writing improve, you'll also have an edge on standardized tests like the SAT, which you'll take in just a few months. Before we launch into the specific comma rules, you have to understand a few fundamentals. One is the independent clause, which we might also call a complete thought or a sentence. However, the word clause seems to imply that it's not the entire sentence, but it's one chunk of a bigger sentence. It contains a subject and a predicate, and importantly, it can stand on its own. All sentences need at least one independent clause. One example is, I love spring. Notice it's really short. Length has nothing to do with whether or not a chunk of words is a complete thought. It's whether or not it has a subject and a predicate and can stand on its own. I hope I pass this class. Fizzy water is my favorite. Each of these contain a subject and a verb, and each can stand on its own, so they are all complete thoughts or independent clauses. You'll also need to be able to recognize sentence fragments. A sentence fragment is missing either a subject or a predicate, and it cannot stand on its own. My cat, Sir Henry Buttons. This one might be confusing because it has a comma there. Some people might be impressed by that and think it must be a complete thought if it has a comma. However, the comma does not make it a complete thought. It's a subject and it does not have a verb. Waiting for spring, forever. Again, these periods are there kind of for emphasis as a stylistic choice. However, just because somebody decides to put in periods does not mean that what comes before them is a complete thought. Both of those are fragments. And if Sarah tells on us. This one's probably the most confusing of the three because Sarah is a subject, tells is a verb, and yet this chunk of words cannot stand on its own because the word if sort of turns the whole clause into a cliffhanger. It's really forcing it to depend on other information to make it complete. So how do we tell them apart? Well, fortunately, there's a pretty easy to use independent clause test. It's this statement. It is true that blank. When you have a chunk of words and you're not sure if it's a complete thought or not, you want to plug it into the blank. Then when you read the whole statement together, if it makes sense, then it's an independent clause. If it does not make sense, it's a fragment. It might be a phrase, it might be a dependent clause, but whatever it is not an independent clause. So let's try some of these. I'm going to take the chunk of words and put it into the blank. It is true that by the store around the corner from my house. When I read the whole thing together, it really does not make sense, so it's not an independent clause. It's a fragment of some sort. Let's try another one. It is true that life is good. That one, when you read it all together, it does make sense, so it's an independent clause. Notice again the difference in length of these two examples. The first one's quite long, and yet it's a fragment. The second one is quite short, but it is a complete thought. So length has nothing to do with whether or not something's a complete thought. And one more. It is true that Miss Martell rocks. Not only does this make sense, it is also true. Complete thought. Next time we're going to talk about how to use commas to organize your ideas, impress your reader, and help your writing flow.